give people a moment to get in. People are coming in. And I'm going to share the screen.
Oh.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us to celebrate the launch of the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women. I'm Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive. We are very excited to have this opportunity in today's Global Day of Learning to showcase some of the encyclopedia's new content, to explore its evolution and impact, which is the focus of this starting panel. This edition is the culmination not just of 4 years of very hard work, but it also builds on a foundation that includes the original 1997 Jewish Women in America, edited by Deborah Moore, who's with us today, and Paula Hyman, as well as the 2006 Jewish Women, A Comprehensive Historical Encyclopedia, published by Moshe Shalvi and edited by Paula Hyman and Dahlia Ofer, which also incorporated Jewish Women in America. In 2009, JWA brought the encyclopedia onto our site, making it freely accessible to users around the world, and the encyclopedia, I am very proud to say, now gets more than 1.6 million unique page views per year from every country with internet access. This edition, which is renamed the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia in memory of publisher Moshe Shalvi and editor Paula Hyman, and in honor of the pioneering Israeli feminist Alice Shalvi, represents a major and ongoing effort to update, revise, expand, and redesign the encyclopedia. Going forward, we will be continuing to revise and add as the online format makes possible, rather than publish giant new editions as we did in this case. And in creating this edition, you'll hear more about some of our priorities, but we paid particular attention to underrepresented areas and topics, including Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews, Jews of color, Jews in the Global South, LGBTQ Jews, Jews with disabilities, and more. I want to just say, as we begin, that my commitment to this project is both professional and personal. Obviously, as the head of JWA, keeping JWA's core content on the scholarly cutting edge and accessible is very important to me. But on a personal note, it was also really important to me to make sure that the work that had been so central to my mother, Paula Hyman, and is a big part of her legacy, would remain relevant and alive. And I have years worth of memories of her cutting obituaries and telling me about new women's stories that she had discovered and was excited to include in the encyclopedia. And it brings me an enormous amount of pride and joy and gratitude to be able to do this work to make sure that it remains accessible to people around the world. Before we begin our conversation, I have some very important thank yous. First of all, I want to thank Jenny Sartori, who's with us on this panel, the editor who directed this new edition from beginning to end, from the big conceptualization to building the editorial board, to finding and shepherding authors around the world, to editing essays, to managing interns, to also many, many administrative details of contracts and permissions and payments and all sorts of things. We had a tremendous editorial board of 60 scholars from around the world who reviewed content and suggested new topics and authors, and we are indebted to them. We also had a wonderful team of interns and assistants who helped us track down images, edit, upload material to the site, and I particularly want to thank our web producer, Patrick Dash, who built the web structure and implemented the new design. And as I'm sure you can guess, there are thousands and thousands of pages to this online encyclopedia, so this was really a gigantic project. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank our donors who understood the importance and impact of the encyclopedia and whose investment in this project made it a reality. As I mentioned, this project is ongoing and would not be possible without the continued support of individuals like you, and we're grateful to everyone who's already contributed to this encyclopedia and to this event today. If you're interested in making a gift, you can do so always at jwa.org/donate, and I thank you all for your support. This launch event is designed to give you a taste of the wide range of content. I'm going to stop sharing that, both in terms of topics, scholarship, geography, JWA has been holding virtual events almost weekly since March 2020 when the pandemic started, with hundreds of attendees each week. But the time slot at which we usually hold our programs, Thursday evenings Eastern Time, is not particularly accessible to Jews beyond North America, South America, and Australia, which is where most of our virtual programming audience has come from. This Global Day of Learning was designed to welcome our global audience, and I hope that all of you here will introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Please make sure to chat to panelists and attendees so we can all see. And also put your questions into the chat, and I'll be sure to bring those into our conversation in the later portion of this program. So now, I am delighted to welcome and introduce our illustrious panelists. Deborah Moore is the Frederick G.L. Hutwell Professor of History and the former director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She's a historian of American Jews who specializes in 20th century urban history and is the author of many books. Her current work focuses on Jewish American photographers of New York. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, and as I mentioned earlier, was co-editor of Jewish Women in America and Historical Encyclopedia. David Ellenson is Chancellor Emeritus and former president of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. He's also Professor Emeritus of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and former director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis, and has written extensively on the history of modern Jewish religious movements, the relationship between religion and state in Israel, and American Jewish life, and contributed to this encyclopedia, as did pretty much everybody on this panel. Jenny Sartori, who I already mentioned, is editor of the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women. Jenny served as a key staff member at JWA from 2000 to 2004, and then returned to JWA, to my great delight, to direct this project after 13 years at Northeastern, where she served as the Associate Director of Jewish Studies. Her research is focused on the shaping of modern Jewish identities, from her graduate work on the education of Jewish girls in 19th and 20th century France through her current study of adoption and Jewish identity in the U.S. today, and she is co-director of the Adoption and Jewish Identity Project. Rachel Harris is Associate Professor of Israeli Literature and Culture in Comparative and World Literature and the program in Jewish Culture and Society at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Her most recent book is Warriors, Witches, Whores, Women in Israeli Cinema. She is a former chair of the Women's Caucus of the AJS and served on the editorial board for the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia. And finally, Alma Heckman is Neufeld-Levin Chair of Holocaust Studies and Assistant Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is the author of The Sultan's Communists, Moroccan Jews and the Politics of Belonging. She served on the editorial board for the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia, and I think I first met her actually maybe 11 years ago when she was an intern at JWA. Thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited to have this conversation. So, Deborah, I'm going to kick it off with you, if that's okay, since you have been involved in this project since the very beginning. And I hope you can start by telling us a little bit about the development of Jewish Women in America, the original historical encyclopedia, those red volumes that so many of us have on our shelves. What sparked that project, and how did you take it from an idea to those groundbreaking red volumes?
So it's wonderful to be here and to see what has happened. The project began with your mother, Paula Hyman of blessed memory, where she had been approached by the American Jewish Historical Society, actually, to do an encyclopedia on Jewish women in America. And she asked me to partner with her. She said, this way we'll get together and we'll have things to talk about. Not that we didn't get together, but it was like, that was the added incentive. So I said yes, not knowing at all what I was getting involved in. And we did get together a lot around her kitchen table, around my kitchen table. It turns out that it was a project unlike most encyclopedias. Most encyclopedias take information that exists out there already, right? And it assembles it together, right, to make it accessible. We had to create that information because there weren't biographies of Jewish women. I remember going to scholars and saying, Senta Yudowsky, would you like to write a bio of her? And people saying, who's Senta Yudowsky, right? Well, she's a Yiddish writer, right? And getting turned down because people hadn't heard of them. So part of what we had to do was, of course, to assemble a wonderful editorial board, but also to get people to suggest names where they were considered obscure because there had been very little written. And so the encyclopedia took shape in that way, discovering a lot of people whom we had never heard of before. But we were really delighted. As you said, you kept on cutting obits out and, oh, here's another person. So there was that excitement of discovering all these Jewish women in America.
And we still have some of that today. I mean, Jenny can tell you how many times I got in touch with her and said, I just realized this person is Jewish and should be in the encyclopedia. And I thought she might stop taking my calls at a certain point. But one of the great things about the encyclopedia, the original, and this continues to be the case, is that it then served as a spur to more research because it was the place where people could find that. David, I know you've been a longtime user of the encyclopedia. Do you want to talk a little bit about its impact on teaching and research?
Yeah, I mean, first, I want to repeat what Deborah and others have said and what you said, Judith. It's a great, great honor to be here today. And it is such a wonderful achievement. Jenny, you just outdid yourself. And I think all of us feel a tremendous sense of gratitude to you and the boards for all you did. And of course, we acknowledge the whole role that Deborah and Paula played in first bringing this together, and then Gail Reamer and you, Judith, and having the JWA put this online and sponsor it. I think one way to capture the incredible significance of this event is if I could be a bit rabbinic or midrashic, as it were, to begin with. I'm always reminded, and here, Deborah, it was your comments that just made me think of this, that the word in medieval Hebrew for a human being is hamadaber. The ability to speak, particularly in a public setting, was seen as the quintessential property that marked someone as fully human. And thus, hamadaber, he who speaks, hamadabrim, they who speak, this becomes synonymous with what it is to be a human being. I think that what has occurred in our age is that the human being has also become, due to all of your work, hamadaberet, she who speaks, and hamadabrot, they who speak, those women who speak as well. And when one thinks about the impact of the encyclopedia, in part it's an element of this larger attempt to have women speak in the public square and to be obviously much more inclusive. And it represents, from a gendered standpoint, the increased power of women in the public arena of the Jewish people and in the larger world. In order to have women's voices speak, one way, of course, and Judith Plaskow, Rachel Adler, and others, all the way to data persons like Mara Benjamin, speak in a theological sense. Also, when you look at some of the earlier works in magazines like Lilith, or the book History of Jewish Women's Spirituality in America that Ellen Umansky co-authored, you have a lot of midrashim, feminist midrashim, that are written. The area of history became much more difficult precisely because of the silence, as it were, that Deborah mentioned, and the view that women in the past were ancillary at best because of the domestic role that traditional Judaism assigned them. Part of what this work has done, and part of what the last 30, 40 years have done in Jewish scholarship and in scholarship in general in the academy, is to, quite frankly, broaden our sense of who it is that has spoken and what it is they have to say. I think of the work, again, of someone, let's say, like a Carol Balin, who I know is the chair of the your Jewish Women's Archive Board,
She's
you know,
online with us today.
What?
She's online with us today.
Oh, okay. Well, hi, Carol. Well, one of the points that I'd like to make is that she and Wendy Zeeler and others, her work at Columbia University brought to the fore the voices of Russian Jewish women who were unknown to us before. And I think part of what's been done, and I think scholars throughout the world go to the archives and to this encyclopedia to look up persons, topics, and the fact that this encyclopedia is even broader and more inclusive through the work of Alma, Rachel, and other people who are on this panel helps us to understand that the largest issue is, if what we want to understand is what does it mean to be human, and what is it that human beings have contributed to an understanding of what does it mean to create a sense of understanding, comprehension, being in the world. This encyclopedia helps us in that much, much larger task because it brings to the fore voices that were previously silent, and it allows persons like me and countless other scholars access to individuals, to groups, to movements, to theoretical approaches that were simply absent before, so that half of our population, if not more, that was silent now become a dabrot. And in this sense, their ability to speak out in the public square represents, in my view, not only a matter of import historically, but frankly, from an ethical standpoint, I think that this encyclopedia helps to create a fuller and a better world and allows the voices of those who were previously silenced to be heard in a sense that was not true earlier.
Thank you, David. And I know that when Moshe conceived of the international version of the encyclopedia, you know, he had done that based on analyzing the Encyclopedia Judaica and realizing that women made up about 3% of that content. And, you know, as Sandy just said in the chat, that, you know, this idea of having this women's version of the Encyclopedia Judaica and being able to make all of those stories, give them the full representation that they deserve. And the internet has really made that go beyond our wildest imaginations, you know, and we know from looking at the analytics that this is a resource that people all over the world use. I can talk a little bit later about some of the research that we did on audience as we were starting this project and sort of recognizing the breadth of that, but how kind of amazing it is to think that there are people, students, people of all backgrounds and ages all over the world who, when they're looking for Jewish history, what they come upon is this. And so women's stories become the access point and the entry point, which is very exciting and very unusual for most of human history. Certainly women were very essential to giving people access to education and transmission of culture and all of that in ways that were not fully recognized. But to have that be part of the sort of more academic learning resources is very new. Jenny, I would love for you to talk a little bit about our approach to the new edition, the new questions and considerations that went into bringing this up into the, 2021.
Of course. First, I just want to thank Judith for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be involved in expanding the narrative of Jewish women's history. And I can say that from the beginning, it's felt like I had a lot of very big shoes to fill, following in the footsteps of Deborah and Paula and Dahlia Ofer. So it has been a labor of love, made a little more complicated than we expected by everything that happened over the past year. But it's been a wonderful experience. And I also want to add my voice to Judith in thanking all the people who were involved. I mean, we had thousands of people involved in bringing this to fruition, from our editorial board and all our authors, who those people go from California on the west coast of the US to Australia and New Zealand. So trying to put together a Zoom editorial board meeting that would satisfy everybody was impossible, but it really shows the breadth of the Jewish community and that we were trying to really have reflected in this edition. And I do also want to thank our interns and volunteers who put in countless hours, including my mother, who I think that the serving as a volunteer editor for us was part of what kept her sane during the quarantine of COVID.
JWA is always a multi-generational project.
It is. So I want to talk a little bit about the process, how we got from there to here, and some of these bigger questions we were looking at. We started out looking at a part that didn't really involve any of our authors or editors. We started off with looking at the website. Since this is the first edition that is starting out fully online, as opposed to the first print edition and then the CD-ROM edition, we started out by kind of surveying the landscape of online encyclopedias that was out there to figure out kind of what are the best practices, what do we like about what we see out there, what do we not like, what do we want to incorporate into ours. And as Judith mentioned, we did do some user research to learn more about our audience and their needs and how best to meet those needs, because you don't want to start thinking about putting in all sorts of bells and whistles that you're going to spend a ton of time and effort and money on, and then discover that those aren't the things that people actually want or will use. And we really wanted to make sure that this edition took full advantage of the benefits of being an online resource, and that it would reflect how people actually read and process information online, which is different from the way they read and process in print. And we didn't want this to sort of read like something that was written for print and then put up online. And so we really thought about that as we figured out what we wanted it to look like and how we wanted it to operate. But then, of course, the other big piece of this was the content. We started out, what we inherited from Jewish Women, A Comprehensive Historical Encyclopedia was 2020 entries. And we wanted to look at both which ones of those entries needed to be updated. And those could be updated in terms of just bringing them up to the present if it was on a person or a topic that was contemporary, or in terms of incorporating some of the tremendous scholarship in the field of Jewish women's history that has just exploded in the 25 years almost since Deborah and Paula put together that first edition. So we knew that we couldn't do that on our own in staff, so that's why we did put together an editorial board, a wonderful editorial board of almost 60 people who were working in a really wide variety of disciplines and subject areas to help us figure out these big questions. And some of our first discussions with the editorial board really were big picture, not the nitty gritty. They were figuring out how we could shape the high level priorities and questions. And really, we started looking at all three words in that phrase, Jewish Women's Encyclopedia. We started with the question of what it means to be encyclopedic. And we wanted to make sure that to the extent possible, we were casting as wide a net as we could to include better coverage of areas that we knew were or underrepresented, and Judith mentioned some of these before, but I'll just say them again, particularly Sephardi and Mizrahi communities, Jewish women of color, women from Jewish communities of the global South, LGBTQ Jews, Jewish women with disabilities, so that we were making sure that we were not reflecting what I think has been a very long tradition of Jewish history being often equated with Ashkenazi history, and a lot of the content in the previous editions being either the US, Europe, or Israel, and we wanted to make sure we were looking broader than that. The definition of Jewishness is a question that we could debate for weeks, and we won't. But clearly the definition of who counts as Jewish has been a contested issue for a long time. And Deborah and Paula grappled with it, and then Paula and Dahlia grappled with it. Like them, we did not define Jewishness according to traditional Jewish law, but we wanted to make sure we had a more flexible and expansive definition of Jewishness that would include both those who are Jewish according to halakha and those whose Jewishness may have other bases, either through conversion that was not according to non-Orthodox practices, or even people who self-defined as Jewish. An interesting case came up kind of in the final stages of putting this together, where the Dutch Jewish author Carl Friedman, who had been included in the previous edition, has died in the intervening period, and it turned out that it came out, I think, in the last couple of years before her death, and then reiterated at her death, that she had not, in fact, been born to Jewish parents. Her family was actually Catholic, and there's no evidence that she ever converted. And many people felt like her writing was sort of deceptive because it implied that she was Jewish. We decided to leave her in. There was we sort of thought, well, does she need to come out if she wasn't actually Jewish? She didn't have a Jewish family. We left her in because she seems to have identified as Jewish. She raised her son to identify as Jewish. And so that is an important part of the modern Jewish story. We left it in, and this is an entry that is still in process. The old one is still up. We're about to put up the new one. And the new entry will grapple with those questions of what that says about modern Jewish identity. The author I'm talking about now is Carl Friedman. So clearly then the last stage of that Jewish women's encyclopedia is the question of women. And that is clearly a less stable category than it was in the 1997 edition, or even in the 2006 edition. And so we specifically defined women as broadly and inclusively and flexibly as we could. We included new entries on trans women and on non-binary people. But beyond adding new entries, we also were very sensitive when we were reviewing existing entries to look at the language that was used in previous editions, and look for places where we might choose today to use different language, different terms, places where more rigid conceptions of a gender binary may have cut off 20, 25 years ago certain interpretive possibilities. So for example, something that maybe 25 years ago might have been seen as or termed quote unquote cross-dressing, or might have been seen as an attempt to escape restrictions on women's activities, might today be seen more as expressions of perhaps a non-binary or gender non-conforming identity. We don't always know that when we're looking at things that happened 100, 200, or 300 years ago, but we should be open to those possibilities, and our text should address that. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions about kind of how we then went about figuring out what was going to be added and included, and what wasn't. But I will pass it along to Rachel.
Yeah, for Rachel and Alma, I'd love to hear from both of you about your involvement and your thoughts about how to bring some of the new kind of expansive thinking that Jenny was talking about to your areas of specialty that you're reviewing the encyclopedia with that in mind.
So I'll go first. I think that what was so significant is that the new encyclopedia really broadened out the areas that it was looking at. And I think that it couldn't have been written in this format 25 years ago. I think that there has been this major shift in the kind of scholarship being done on women more generally. And so if you think about Nashim, the Journal for Jewish Women, right, that gets started in 1998. And that sort of heralds, I think in some way, a kind of coalescing of women's studies in an Israeli context. And so the kind of work that we'd begun to see in the US in as early as like the late 70s and the early 80s, and the work that Deborah and Paula Hyman like really pioneered in so many ways, wasn't happening for another 10, 15, 20 years in Israel for many reasons. And so what we're really seeing now is just this flourishing of a generation of scholars who themselves are doing the kind of historical spade work on many of the women who are their foremothers, and really looking at who they were, finding some of the archival materials on them. And so instead of us talking about a handful of very well-known female figures in the early kibbutz movement, early Zionism, we're not just talking about Golda Meir now, we're talking about this incredibly rich, across the board understanding of these women. And we see that like this generation of female scholars is doing so much of the work to sort of recover their history and their legacy. And we talk about this as a historical document, and it's a kind of digging out of history, but I think it underserves the enormity of this project, because it isn't just historical figures that feature in the archive. It's also culture producers, artists, filmmakers, writers, and their legacy, and it's sort of even just being able to talk about their work, so that people who are interested, who find one story, can go find, a whole collection of novels, who find one film, they can go and sort of look at an entire body of work. And the other thing that's so amazing about this collection is that it isn't just individual biographical entries, that there are all these like longer form pieces that bring together real scholarship on who these people are, how they interacted together, what their meaning is, what their contribution was as a body of people. And I think those longer essays really shape the field itself, that it isn't just the ability to find out what one person did, but a way of thinking of scholarship for the future as well, and places to go. And I think that those have been really, really significant pieces. And I know that even as we've been working on this new encyclopedia over the last 5 years, some of this material is just being found. We had trouble finding some of these entries early on because we hadn't yet identified the graduate student who is now doing her research work on those people. And so it's been a lot of the work was also understanding who participates in the field, finding those contributors. And as David said, elevating those voices so that you're getting this double elevation of voices, because a lot of this scholarship is by women as well. And so you're getting the scholarship of the women speaking for these other women who preceded them. And I think that adds to this intergenerational legacy that we talk about the archive representing.
And I think also one of the pieces that we've seen is that then, you talked, Rachel, about how the encyclopedia gives access or frames the work of cultural producers, and then the encyclopedia itself also sparks other kinds of cultural production. So we've seen the ways in which the encyclopedia has been a key resource for people who are, writing books, not scholarly books, but sort of general audience books, who are writing movies, writing plays, and are looking for material, and they find it online in the encyclopedia because it's accessible. And so then that leads to sort of the public, more public-facing materials that would never happen without access to those scholarly materials in a format that is easy to find. And I really want to give credit both to Moshe Shalvi for kind of having the vision of creating a worldwide encyclopedia, which is such an enormous project. It's hard to imagine someone wanting to take that on. And then also to Gail Reamer for bringing it onto JWA's site and making it freely accessible, because that has been a game changer in terms of who actually can use this material.
I want to also just piggyback off of what Rachel just said about how we had to go digging for the graduate student who was researching this person or this topic. And sometimes we weren't able to find that graduate student or that scholar. And so there are plenty of entries that we would have wanted to add on individual people or on some of those topical entries that we just haven't been able to add yet, because we haven't been able to locate the person who is either doing that research or interested in doing that research or has the ability to write. So that is part of why it's going to be an ongoing process, because if it's not there now, don't assume that it wasn't something that we didn't think was important. It might have been something that we think is important, but we just haven't been able to find an author for yet.
Right, and so we hope this will inspire students to take on new projects for things that may not be there yet. And I have a very much a not yet attitude towards this. Anything that's not there, it's not that it is not going to be there. It's that it's just not there yet, but it will be.
Absolutely.
Alma?
Well, I want to reiterate my thanks to Jenny for this monumental undertaking that I think is probably becoming very clear through what we've all been talking about. It's not just the most current update, right? This is a long, long set of theoretical developments and historical conversations in developments over a very long period of time. So thank you again to Jenny for your stewardship of this incredible project. And thank you to Judith for your work on this project as well. And everybody involved. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be involved in whatever way that I can be. So one of the things that has been touched on has been the need to include more Sephardi and Mizrahi voices in the updated version of the Encyclopedia. And that makes sense. I mean, when we talk about genealogically where the Encyclopedia came from, it wasn't originally this global, monstrously like good undertaking spanning the globe. It initially was much more limited, and it sort of developed a life of its own in a way that is now perfectly suited to the internet and to its life on the JWA website, such that it can be continually updated as the encyclopedia's mission updates, so too can the entries for the encyclopedia. So, you know, initially JWA, my thoughts on the JWA when I was an intern there back 11 years ago, as Judith mentioned, it was much more about Jewish women in the United States. And that was much more its focus. And it's developed into this much more ambitious, globe-trotting entity. And so the encyclopedia
Alma, we've lost you. There's never a Zoom without a moment of someone freezing, usually when it's their turn to speak. I don't know if you can hear us. I'm gonna jump in with a question from our audience, and Alma will pick up where you were when you're back with us. Marcia asked about our criteria for determining who is in, who is out in the final edition, and I can start by saying there is no final edition. This is just the first round of things that have been launched for this edition. But I'll turn to Jenny to talk a little bit more about that process.
So this was a really hard process to go about. I mean, it was a multi-stage process. I mean, the first steps were just to generate possibilities. And we gathered suggestions from our editorial board and our existing authors, but this is another place where we really wanted to cast a wider net. So we did an outreach campaign to gather suggestions from as broad an audience as we could, because we knew that they would be able to surface names of individuals and organizations who might be largely unknown outside their immediate communities. And I think this is probably somewhat similar to what Deborah and Paula had to do in the beginning, because these are not necessarily well-known names. And so we knew that there would be lots of people and who are doing very important things who scholars might not actually know about. So we gathered of those suggestions as broadly as we could. We did a social media campaign. We put notices on academic listservs. We surveyed as many scholars as we could. We ended up with a list of somewhere between 750 and 800 suggestions. And we knew that we could not include all of those people and topics in this initial launch of the new version, or we would never launch it. And we wanted to launch it, but we didn't want to wait until we had everything perfect. So we had to do some prioritizing. We knew that. We internally within the staff, we kind of weeded out some names that we thought were maybe less significant, may have been important to their local communities, but not beyond. Some people who we thought were probably worthy of inclusion at some point, but may have been too young, where we didn't have a hard and fast age cutoff, but we also did know that if you're talking about somebody who may be 30 years old, you can't make any kind of real analysis of their broader significance and their broader accomplishments. So they might be better suited to wait until they're a little bit older. There's also the practical question of the younger you put somebody in, the more often you're going to need to update it. And that is complicated. So we juggled a lot of those things. We surveyed our editorial board where we sent everybody, we divided everything up into sort of interest groups so that people could look most closely at things that were in their own subject area and make some assessments of how to prioritize what should go in first, then what might be part of the second batch, and then what can wait till later. We also are very mindful of kind of broadening out also our definition of quote unquote accomplishment, that often people who get represented in encyclopedias are people who are kind of known as important people, kind of maybe old-fashioned definitions of what it means to be accomplished, maybe particularly professionally, but we also wanted to recognize that if you're looking at lots of different communities in different times and places, the opportunities for women to become well-known public figures may just not have been there. So to sort of be sensitive to what to how different communities might define important in different ways. So after all of that, we came up with a list of about 400 people, which we knew was still too long, and kind of, weeded it down gradually till about 250. And then from there, a lot of it really had to do with who we could find authors for. So there are plenty of people who we still think are very important to be included, but we just have that we're still looking for people to find author to write. Also, there I can say that COVID really did throw a wrench into, there are plenty of entries that are actually in process that just couldn't get done because people over the past year were not able to access their files. They couldn't go to their office to get their books. They couldn't go do the archival research. As Deborah was saying at the beginning, unlike a lot of encyclopedias where you're sort of synthesizing scholarship that's already out there, this involves a lot of primary research. And if people couldn't travel and couldn't go to the archives, they couldn't write. Or also we were very sensitive to the needs of a lot of authors who were thrown into teaching online for the first time and very complicated. And as well as with very heavy home responsibilities for their children and their families. And so that has impacted on who is in this not final edition, but that we hope will continue to be included, that we'll be adding on an ongoing basis. And I see that we have not gotten Alma back, unfortunately.
We have a question that I can address very briefly from Audrey about, did we include women who were Jewish and accomplished, but not their achievements or their work was not primarily in the Jewish world? And we certainly did. I mean, part of our commitment, and I think this was true for all of the editions of the encyclopedia, was not to define Jewish importance only in terms of what takes place within the confines of the Jewish community. And that leads me to a question I wanted to ask and open to all of you, which is, the encyclopedia is a work by scholars and experts, and we at JWA think of it as kind of the most academic resource on our site. So it was really surprising for us to discover when we did some of the user research in advance of the expansion that only about half of the users are sort of scholars, teachers, and students. Half of the users are a kind of general audience, lifelong learners, people looking for information that's relevant to their family history or to local history. Also a lot of clergy, including a lot of clergy from other faiths, who were interested particularly in some of the material on women in the Bible. It turns out there really aren't other resources on women in the Bible that are not from a Christian perspective. So I've been thinking a lot about that kind of public history impact of the encyclopedia and bringing the scholarly content to a broader audience and engaging new audience in Jewish history through the lens of women's lives, but also what happens when you're framing women's lives in a Jewish context and in a gendered context where that may not ever have been the lens that was put on their story before. So I'd love to hear people's reflections on sort of what is made possible by that framework.
So I'll start and say that, among the things that I know we insisted on in the very first version of this encyclopedia was an introductory paragraph that was not boring, right? that somehow drew you in. We wanted to write for that other half of that audience out there. And therefore, you'll find these introductory paragraphs that are hopefully intriguing to pull people in. I think that what you're describing is great in terms of a public history, and what it's doing is it's in a sense recalibrating how people think about and understand the world by suggesting both the significance of gender and the significance of Jewishness, that these make you think about what's happening in different ways, that raises slightly different kinds of questions than what you might find in a standard encyclopedia entry. And that would be true also in terms of how accomplishment is understood. So all of these things sort of tilt in very positive ways what's available and what has been written, but does make a challenge for those of us, who are writing, right? We've got to remember who we're writing for.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Deborah has just said, and the point that you made, Judith, about the audience that's reading this. Clearly for academics and scholars, it's an invaluable resource. But the reality is the online nature of it and the way in which media communicates in this day and age, and Rachel's comments certainly touched on this, leads to a kind of democratization that takes it outside of the academy, or at least exclusively outside of the academy, so that I'm delighted to hear who and what the readership is. And I think it's something we all anticipated. I know that for myself, in writing certain of the articles, the very lens that gender provides allows for analyses that simply would not have been present before. I mean, I think of one entry that I had written initially for Deborah and Paula in the 1997 version on Zionism in the United States. But part of what it covered was philanthropy. And it's interesting, we often think of philanthropy in general, particularly in our own day and age. And I think of the work of someone like Lila Corwin Berman as involving these tremendously large, I'll call them benefactors, foundations who are making extremely large gifts. But part of what I saw in the article that I wrote on Zionism was the whole way in which philanthropy had to be understood. Hadassah and other groups really galvanized literally tens of thousands of women and children and others to raise tremendous amounts of money that in fact allowed for advancements to be made in American Zionism that would have otherwise been impossible. And one of the funniest parts was that Louis Levinsky, who was head of the Zionist Organization of America, wanted to take the money that Hadassah had raised in this way, contending in a gendered way that women shouldn't be in charge of this money, and that they were behaving in a very unladylike way in not handing this over to the ZOA for distribution. At that point, the then head of Hadassah in America turned to Henrietta Zold, who was then in Palestine, and Henrietta Zold said, "No, I don't think they're behaving in an unladylike way at all. And these women who've raised this money through nickels, dimes, and pennies, they should retain control over this and not hand it over to men." And I suspect there are countless entries like this, particularly the larger ones that many of you have spoken about, that allow these fields to be looked at in completely novel ways. One question that I did have just very quickly, and I don't know, Deborah perhaps could answer this as well as Jenny. Paula, I remember, had said to me that when she first, when you all were first doing this encyclopedia, it was not always easy to get people to participate, precisely because they didn't feel that a women's encyclopedia was a serious enterprise. And I wondered, one, was that your impression, Deborah? And two, Jenny, has it changed in these 23 years?
And just a quick answer, it was definitely the case. That's why I'm Yenta Serdowski. I mean, we went through quite a few people, and the distinguished scholars of Yiddish, you know, they weren't going to write about her. But we also found, you know, grad students and stuff to do that kind of writing. So it's so great to see Alma back. I will shut up.
Hi, I'm so sorry about that and sorry to disrupt the conversation. It's amazing. After teaching on Zoom for a year and a half now, we still get these tech problems, and this was the time that, you know, Xfinity Wi-Fi decided to just like crap out for a while. So sorry about that, and I don't mean to disrupt the flow of conversation. But I just wanted to highlight a few entries on the new editions, the Sephardi Mizrahi entries, including Zohar Al-Fasia, who, you know, we talk about what are the opportunities of the encyclopedia. And one of the things is that, you know, Zohar Al-Fasia, she would have been known, she's known still as one of the most famous Moroccan Jewish singers in Morocco. But when she migrated to Israel, she was still well known among Moroccan Jews. She wasn't really well known among the wider Israeli public. She wasn't well known as this megastar. I mean, she performed for the King of Morocco on multiple occasions. She was this really giant megastar that had been largely forgotten when she was removed from her original Moroccan context. And something that I'm so delighted about is that the encyclopedia has now a really wonderful entry about her. And so students can rediscover her work, rediscover her music, and use her kind of entry as a way to think about the place of Moroccan Jewish musicians, not only in Morocco, but in Israel and around the world. Yes, the entry has audio as well, so you can listen to Zohar Al-Fasia's voice. Not only we get the words, the speaking of Zohar Al-Fasia, as David was talking about, you know, having the speaker, women speaker and women authors, but we also can hear her sing on the entry, which is really fantastic. And so everybody can rediscover her voice and learn more about this in ways that they might not have otherwise learned unless they were specialists in Morocco or in Moroccan music or something like that. So now she can become a megastar once again to a much wider audience. I also want to highlight Elena Benatar, whose entry was written by a leading scholar who was working on a book about Elena Benatar, and who's Susan Gilson Miller. And she was, you know, a lawyer in Casablanca in the interwar period, who was absolutely instrumental in working with the Joint Distribution Committee during the Second World War in helping European Jewish refugees that were coming through Morocco during the Second World War. and helping them find work permits, or helping them get transit visas, helping them in all of these different ways, doing really a monumental amount of work with these refugee populations, including, I mean, maybe, I don't know how many people on the call are aware of the labor camps in North Africa as well. And that's its own very, very complicated story. But Elena Benatar was absolutely instrumental in helping the liberation process of those camps, and coordinating with the American Army and with the American Joint Distribution Committee to the liberation of those camps, and to finding employment for a lot of those internees and helping them move along. She makes for a much better story than the film Casablanca ever would. So I hope there'll be some feature-length film about Elena Benatar at some point. And then, you know, I wrote a new entry as well about this woman who was the sister of a very, very famous Moroccan Jewish communist, Abraham Serfati. If anybody knows anything about Moroccan Jewish communists, they would know about Abraham Serfati. Not that I expect everybody to know anything about Moroccan Jewish communists, but she herself, you know, and he always said that she died as a martyr for him, that she, you know, she was picked up by the police, she was tortured, she died a few years after this incident. She was described as very frail. And Abraham Serfati said that, yes, she was a martyr for the police trying to get to him, but that's not exactly true. And something that I tried to really highlight in my piece about her is that she was a very active communist in her own right. She was very, very active in posting flyers all around Casablanca, and in organizing petitions and doing all of this kind of work herself. And she's so often only understood in relationship to her brother, and that I wanted to highlight her and in her own terms as much as possible as well. And so that's just, those are three small examples of the new entries on Sephardi and Mizrahi women. And this is a real area of growth and potential continued growth in the encyclopedia. So as grad students, and this is a growing field, it's a growing field of scholarship in and of itself. So as students and as faculty encounter more of these really exceptional women, I hope that the JWA Encyclopedia will become a place where some of these women will really be highlighted, and become a place where they can be really showcased here. And so we have, it's a real place of potential growth. I've just highlighted 3 Moroccan women because that's what I work on. But you know, there's a wide world of Jewish women in the Middle East and North Africa to highlight and to explore. And Mizrahi women as they travel to the United States and as they travel elsewhere around the world as well. So for those of you who are attending and have either already written entries or are interested in entries or can think of somebody that you know, that isn't included, that would be a wonderful entry in Sephardi and Mizrahi studies, you know, welcome, because this is a real area of growth and necessity. So anyway, I'm so sorry again for popping off. I'm now on like some weird Xfinity network. So hopefully it works.
Well, the truth is, Alma, you anticipated and partially answered my last question, and I think we'll have to leave it there because we're out of time. But you know, I think the real question that the project raises is what the next frontiers are, and what you know, as we've said, this is an unfinished project. We're continuing to work on it. There's a lot of material that's already in progress, and there's material that we can't even imagine yet that we will recognize in the coming years is essential. And we look forward to you know, the participation of the wider field and helping us identify those areas for the next frontiers and helping us bring those stories onto our site. This is such a partnership of so many people, and we are really grateful to all of your participation. So I want to thank all of the panelists for this conversation today, and to all of the folks in the audience for your excellent questions. I recognize that we didn't get to all of them, but this will be an ongoing conversation, I am sure. I also just want to point out that this is just the beginning of our Global Day of Learning. We have many sessions coming up. I hope you'll consider joining us for one or more of them. All of the sessions will be at the same link that you used for this session now. And the last thing that I want to say, and this is, these sessions are a way to get a taste of some of the other content we'll be hearing directly from people who wrote some of the pieces. I also want to invite you all into a larger celebration that JWA is having this year. This is actually our 25th anniversary year, and this launch represents the beginning of our celebrations of our 25th anniversary. So I hope that everyone will save the date for our big virtual celebration event on Thursday, November 4th at 8 p.m. And again, I want to thank you all for being here with us today and for your contributions to this project, to this conversation, which is ongoing and which is part of the continued unfurling of knowledge about Jewish women. So thank you all, and thank you for being with us.